Did I switch it off? Sorry. So I start again. No? Okay, so I was saying about the global problem. Let's say that I have to implement a form. And here is just an input with a label. And I have to style this label. So I will just write some CSS and say the font style is italic and add some color. That's easy enough, right? But then let's say that one of my colleagues has to implement this other element, which is sort of a stamp that you put on documents to say that they are approved. And he's going on and write all this CSS, right? It's a bit more complicated. We use a transform rotate, but nothing really impossible. But here we already have our global problem. We define two classes with the same name of label. So if I go and apply the label class on one of my elements, both those styles will apply, and the result is not really what we expect. And this is not everything. Because one other colleague of mine wants to use Bootstrap for his grid system. And Bootstrap is defining a label class. It's also defining a table and defining a row and more than 300 more classes. So every time I decide to use Bootstrap or another CSS framework, I have to make sure that none of my CSS classes that I define is colliding with the classes of my framework. And so in a nutshell, what the CSS global problem is the fact that every class in CSS is defined as a global. There's no way to namespace our classes. And if you code it with some languages like really any other language, JavaScript, Ruby, Python, choose which one you prefer, think about coding in that language and only being able to define global variables. That would be a mess. No one will do that. But in CSS, it's still the only way you can define a class. You can only define it as a global. So people started to try to find some solutions to this problem. And one maybe naive solution could be to let's just get rid of the classes. Let's inline our styles. And at first sight, it's quite easy. You just have your element, you put a style attribute, you put your CSS, and that's it. There are no classes, no clashes. That becomes a bit complicated though when you have more styles. So you have everything on one single line. And if you want to repeat the same element more than once, you have to repeat the same styles. And what if you want to change one of the properties? You then have to go and change it in all the elements where you used it. And there are ways to fix this using tools that inline your styles, but these tools are based on classes. So we are again from the starting point, we are using classes. And even if we fix all these problems, all this code has to be downloaded by the browser, and that's a repetitive code that gets downloaded for every element on my page. But let's say that, okay, we fixed the problem of inlining, we don't have problems with bandwidth, we still have issues. We cannot define pseudo selectors with inline styles, so no hover, no before, no after. You cannot define media query, you cannot define keyframes or support queries, I think they're called. So this inline solution is really not working very well. And I've been working for the last 3 weeks on implementing an HTML email template. If you work on that, you know that it's painful. And there you can only use inline styles. So trust me when I tell you that they don't work. So what's today the most used solution is something called a CSS methodology. And there are many of these. Here in this slide we can see object-oriented CSS, BEM or atomic designs, but there are more and more of them. And they all work in a similar way. So I'll show you an example of this. So again, we have our label class. And what a CSS methodology tells you is instead of calling this class simply label, call it menu __ label, because maybe you're using it in a menu element. And maybe add a -- on just to differentiate the state from the others. And then when I need a second label, for example, for a hero element, I'll just call it hero underscore label dash dash hover. And the label for a form is going to be called form underscore underscore label. So what the methodologies tell us is, instead of giving your class a simple name, give them a name that describes where they are used. And this is good because we can define semantic names. When I read form underscore label, I know that that's the label for the form. So the name of the class is much more clear, much more descriptive. There is a problem though. That is the fact that we developers have to name the classes. This is not given automatically. So when I'm creating a class, I have to think, okay, this class is used in a form, so I have to call it form underscore label. Or what was the convention for my methodology? So when you're working and maybe you're hunting a bug, this is not really the first thing you want to think about. You have a label, you just want to give the class the name label and don't think about it and go with your code. But if you go with one of these methodologies, you have to think about the names you give to your classes. But once we give these classes this sort of unique name, there are way less collisions because, of course, I no longer have just one single word. I have a more complex class structure, name structure, and there are less chances that two classes collide. Unfortunately, less chances doesn't mean that you have 0% chances. If I'm working on a form underscore label and my colleague is working on a form, he can create a form underscore label class. So there is nothing that is preventing this name collision. So as you can see, we have some good things and some bad things about these methodologies. And today they are still the most used approach. Probably you're using them in your production website. Well, the question is, can we do better than this? Can we find some tool that allows us to just don't care about collision and just give to our classes the first name or the one that seems more appropriate? And there are actually solutions for this, and I'm going to show to you today two of them. One is called css-modules, and it's something that you can use today. It's used in production by many companies. And the other one is something that you might want to use in the future, and that's web components. If you use web components in the last few years, they've been announced around 5 years ago. They are quite different from what you have now. The specification have been completely rewritten, and they've been released around 1 month ago. So we're going to check the differences there. But before I explain to you any of these, we have to clarify what a component is, because all of these approaches are based on the idea of components. Now, you might have your own definition of component or some idea of what it is. For this talk, I'm going to stick with this definition. A component is an atomic piece of UI, UX that you can reuse. And a good example of a component could be, for example, a button. So when I put a button on the page, it has some styles and it has some behavior, and I can just reutilize it as many times as I want. So these are actually, most of the HTML tags are actually components. So this idea of components is really nothing new. What changed in the last few years is the fact that we developers can now create our own components. It used to be that if I wanted a new tag added to the HTML specs, I had to write my draft, get it approved, and get all the browser to implement it. But now, thanks to libraries like Angular or Polymer, we can create our own components and use them in our page. So I'm a React developer, mostly. So all the examples that we're going to see are written in React. I don't want to teach you React. This is not the topic of this talk, but I need you to at least understand how you create a small component so that you can follow on the examples. So let's go step by step. This is probably the smallest component that you create in React, or one of the smallest. It's called hello, and it's just a function that is returning what looks like HTML. So it's a bit weird if you have never seen it, but what this gives us is the possibility to then create this HTML tag called hello. And then when what the browser sees is something like this. So React compiles it for us and basically substitute the hello tag with the HTML that we define in the function. Are you still with me so far? Okay. So let's bring it up a little bit with this second component called label. That is a bit different from the previous one. We could use this, for example, to define this element that we saw earlier. So there are three differences between label and hello. The first thing is that the function is taking one argument called props. The second one is that we are rendering props.children, and the curly brackets there means render this. And the third one is that we are defining a class name of label. Now, class name is the way in React you use in React to define a class. So every time you read class name, just think that's a class. So the way we use this label is, for example, like this. Again, we have a tag called label, but this tag takes some children, in this case approved, and when it gets compiled, we just get the div with the class of label and the children that we define. Still okay? Okay, so now you know React. You can you can update your LinkedIn profile. Okay, so now we know that. Let's see how CSS modules work. We consider again our label component, but in this case you notice that I didn't fill the class name yet. The first thing I want to do is to write some CSS. Okay, and this is we don't really care what the CSS is, but what's important is that we have this label, class label with all the styles. And we put these styles in one separate file. For example, we can call it label.css. And it's a good practice when you create a component to create also one file with all the styles of that component. And this file, label.css, is a CSS module. So this is all it takes basically to create a CSS module. Now, if you use modules before in some other language, or I think in Java they are called packages or something like that, you know that if you want to use them, you have to import them. And that's exactly what we're going to do. We import from label.css. And the CX object there stands for classes, but you can really call it styles or whatever makes sense for you. I just call it CX because I didn't have much space in the slides. So now that we imported this module, how do we apply the label class to our div? We simply do cx.label. So if you use some function module, so a module that exposes some function in some other language, this is pretty similar. But instead of calling a function, you sort of call a class name. So the module is exposing all the classes that are defined in it. Okay, so this is how you use CSS modules. Why are they useful though? To know that, we have to see what CSS modules, the engine, is doing behind the scenes. So this is our starting point, our CSS module file. When we give it to the CSS modules engine, we get back the same CSS, but the class name has been renamed. And has been renamed in something that looks like a hash. So the only thing really that CSS modules does is to rename our classes. There are other features, but they are not so important. And from the HTML side, this is the code we define in the React component, and this is what goes to the browser. So also our class name has been renamed in the browser. So, as I said, CSS modules is renaming our classes. To see why this is useful, we have to consider an example with more than one module. So for example, here we have 3 modules, and all of them are defining a class called label. So in a normal environment, this wouldn't work. The 3 classes would clash, and all the styles would be applied at once. So this is not really manageable. But in CSS modules, this is what we get after the compilation step. We have the same CSS code, but the class names have been renamed to something unique. So what we achieve is the possibility to just create a class with whatever name we want, and be sure that we won't have any collision. So I want to show you a quick demo of how this works. Okay, so here I have a very small React application that is defining the 2 components that we saw earlier. And this is the code for this application. Actually, let me... Okay, so this is how these are the 2 components. One is called label, and can you see? Maybe not. One is called label, and the other is called stamp. So the hello here is a label, and the other I call it stamp. And we simply use in this way. It's just a tag. So label, we pass some text, and for the stamp, same. Let's see how they are defined. Let me start with label, maybe. Okay, label is just returning some label. And as you can see here, we are importing a CSS module called label.css. And let's see the code for the label.css. So all we do in here is defining one single label class with our styles. And this is how we then apply the class name cx.label. Now, if we go instead in the stamp, we see that we are also importing a module, but this time is the stamp module. And we apply the class in more or less the same way. And if we go in the stamp module, we are also defining just one single class called label. And what the browser sees is this. One component with a class called source label underscore some hash, and the other one is called source stamp label and some hash. So what CSS module did for us is taking the name of the class and renaming it. So we don't have to worry if we just create more classes with the same name. We just think what is the name that makes more sense for my component. As you can see here, the name is not just some random hash. You can actually configure it. But in this case, it's telling me that this code is defining in the source folder under the label, and the class is called label. So it's also quite easy to figure out where that code was defined. So these are CSS modules, and I want to show you now what you can do with web elements, because with CSS modules you need to use some library. So you need to use CSS modules, of course, but then you need to rely on React or Angular or some other JavaScript framework. With web components, web elements, when they will be released, currently they're only supported by Chrome, but when they will be supported by all the major browsers, you can do that with just simple HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So you don't have to rely on a third party. Okay, this is working. Okay, so also here I have a simple application. I define 2 elements. One that is just taking my text and making it italic and red, and the other is again our marker. And then I have some span and a div. So if we look at the if we look at the page, is just this. We are using a fancy paragraph element, which is this one, hi there, and we use it 2 times, and then we have an X marker element that is this one, and then I have my div at the bottom and a paragraph. So the first thing I'm doing is to import one of the elements in this way. I have a link with rel import, and I import, for example, fancy p. And if I go to look at the code of fancy p, we have, first of all, a template where I'm going to define all the styles and the CSS of my element. So, for example, the HTML is just simple paragraph, and slots stands for the children. So, in this case, it's going to be approved, denied, or if you ask nicely. And here at the bottom, I'm defining a new tag. So I'm telling the browser, hey, there is a new tag, which is called fancy p. And if you want to know how it's done, you just go and check the fancy p object, which is this class that is extending an HTML element. So what I'm doing effectively is to create a new tag. I'm telling the browser that a new tag exists. And the first thing I'm doing is to create a shadow DOM. Now, shadow DOM is a bit complicated, but what it's doing basically is to create a separate DOM from the page that doesn't get influenced by all the rest and does not influence the outside world. So we can see it in here. If I go check this element, so I have this fancy paragraph, and we can see that the text doesn't appear on the page because I don't have any highlight. But here I have a shadow root that is taking, that it's the thing that gets displayed. And in here, I render my HTML, my template tag. And the cool thing about this is the fact that my styles are just this. It's just a paragraph. So I don't even need to create a class anymore because my template is so small, it's just one paragraph. I just prefer to style the paragraph. So here I have my paragraph with a font size 5, font style italic. And if I go back in my main page, also here I have a paragraph, but this is not inheriting any of the styles that I define on my component. So what web elements and shadow DOM gives us is the ability to just take one part of the page and say, hey, this is completely separate from everything else. Don't take the styles from the outside and don't pollute the styles of the page. Okay. There was a lot of information, but I'm going to post the code online and the slides. So there are many approaches. We saw only 2 of them, and the next speaker is going to introduce some others. So this is really the way where we are going. We are building apps based on components. And the important thing to understand is that a component is a sort of isolated, is a container that has all the HTML, the CSS, and the JavaScript that is needed to display and behave in the page. Or if you prefer, it has all the styles and all the user interaction. But the most important thing of components is not that you can reuse them. Of course, that's really nice and important, but it's the fact they don't care about other components. So when you build in this way, you can just think about having your own single component. You build for it, and you don't care about other stuff that go on the page, because you are sure that you cannot be influenced and you cannot influence them. So this is what we are going, how we are going to build applications in the future. So thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions.
Yeah, yep. I have a question.
Sure.
So in components, is there a way to share variables or styles or
Yeah. So for example, in CSS modules, a module could import another module, for example. For web elements, you can do something similar. So like your element can import another element that is basically defining some styles.
So if you, for example, in module, you can use SAS and import SAS variables.
Yeah. So
for components. Can you define colors, variables for colors, for example?
You can right now. No, are we talking about web elements?
Yeah, web components.
Okay, so right now it's a bit tricky, but with JavaScript variables coming, you can just define variables and pass them to the component in this way. Or you can have one HTML module, let's say, that just defines some styles, and all the modules that need to use it just import it. So yeah, there are solutions for that.
So you will have to pass a variable to the component from the HTML?
So when you define your component and then you use it, meaning you just create the tag and you set the stuff. So you can set an attribute. For example, you can, like the marker, I can say marker with an attribute of size equal big. And in that way, in that case, your component behaves differently. Use another kind of CSS or stuff like that. Or you can just define some CSS variables, and then your component is going to read those variables and render differently.
So what about a component, a web component?
Yeah.
A button that will trigger the form that is on top of the...
Sorry, a button there?
A button,
Mm-hmm.
when you click it,
yeah,
it will trigger the form with some kind of JavaScript or something.
Sure. Okay, this is not really in the style, but it's slightly related. So what you could do, for example, is to add another attribute on click, and your button component, let's say, when gets clicked, fires a JavaScript event, for example, and then you have to capture it, because in the end, like normal buttons are firing events. So when you define a component, this can fire an event as well. It can be a custom event, for example, or the native one can just pass up the native one. So components are really are atomic. They are a module that is separate from the outside world. But in case you need, you can send out events or stuff like that. There are two. Like
for CSS models, do you have any recommendations for the naming convention, like following them or?
The point of the CSS module is you don't need that. Okay. So like in BAM, you have a form that defines a label. You have to do form __ label, for example. In CSS modules, is a label, you just call it a label. And the idea is that the module is so small that you define like 3-4 classes, and you don't really have the problem that the names are too complicated. So if you keep them small, you don't really need a convention. One thing is maybe use snake case, meaning that if you have more than one word, each first letter is capitalized, because it's easier to use in JavaScript, but just for that. But really, just call them as you want is not a problem.
As far as I know, regarding CSS modules, there is another way to target child elements from a parent element. I mean, imagine you have a button component and you have an icon component. If you want to target the icon from the button CSS, since the class names are dynamically generated, you don't have to wait to target them.
So what you want to do is the icon is going to style the button.
The button is going to style the icon.
Oh, the button is going to style the icon. Again, it's similar to the question he asked. You could instead simply add a parameter to the icon to say the icon is big or the icon is red, something like that. So instead of doing with CSS, or if you want, you can define global CSS classes. So you can say to CSS modules, hey, this class, don't rename it, just use the name. But this is really an edge case. I would suggest to use an attribute name instead.
That example, what happened with like hover events or something like that?
For hover,
For example, you hover over the button for 1 hour. If you want to change the color of the icon when you hover over the button, you need to target.
Okay.
For me, this is a big problem. I don't know if it's close or not. When I try them.
In that case, you could use like a global name.
Yeah, but if you have saved using global,
You could. Yeah, but you could.
You can import other classes from other files in CSS modules.
Yeah, but the problem is.
you can extend them, right? But can you get the name of the class?
Yeah, I think so.
I never had the issue before, but yeah, I guess you can. Okay, that's it. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.